First off, I'd like to thank all of you for having me here today. I'm grateful that all of y'all braved the weather in order to be with us here today. And the Cuban Missile Crisis is obviously one of the turning points of the 20th century. It is a situation where both the USSR and the United States went toe-to-toe in a situation where it also basically redefined, I think, our understanding of the possibility of nuclear war, what it would mean to us, and furthermore, I think it shaped a lot of the way that we go about our foreign policy today and how effective it is to be confrontational or to be conciliatory towards those with which we have international conflicts. And so today we're going to go over the lessons learned about the Cuban Missile Crisis. We're going to do a slight overview at the very beginning, and then we'll get into a little bit of what happens as a result of our understandings nowadays. First off, we have a quote from Secretary of State Dean Acheson, and this is kind of his way of summing up what happened. I apologize, I didn't know this would get in people's way. That we've gotten eye to eye, we're eyeball to eyeball, and the other fellow just blinked. The way that we talk about this kind of negotiating, about we're going to stand up to the ones who are our challengers in the international system in the United States, we call it brinksmanship. Pushing the other fellow as far as he will go to see if he's going to be the one to back down or if you're going to be the one to back down. Are we going to call the other side's bluff? And in this one, obviously, Secretary Acheson is saying we succeeded by out-bluffing the other person. So the Cuban Missile Crisis is the closest we've ever come to nuclear war. It is a situation where there's still some controversy over how the events actually played out. And last but not least, there's even more controversy over exactly what lessons we should take from the Cuban Missile Crisis as a way of guiding us in the foreign policy issues that we face today, such as nuclear weapons in Iran, facing off with the Chinese in terms of some of the territorial disputes that are now taking place right off their coast in the South China Sea, and some of these other things. And so, is the Cuban Missile Crisis a good parallel for some of these situations that we face today? First off, one thing that we have to realize in part of our background is to know that the United States had a massive nuclear superiority over the USSR in 1962. Now, as part of the 1960 presidential election, President Kennedy had often talked about a missile gap, without really knowing, even though I believe someone in the Pentagon, Central Intelligence Agency, and so forth, were aware that the United States had a considerable advantage over the Soviet Union in terms of actual missiles. The Soviet Union had a lot of which they would call intermediate range ballistic missiles, capable of hitting targets in Asia, in Europe, and so forth, but not really much in the way of capability of hitting the American homeland. And so this idea of a missile gap was something that Kennedy, even though he accused of it, we still had a massive superiority over the USSR in 1962. And as we see here, what we have is what in political science we technically call a second strike counter value capability. It's a fancy way of saying if they hit us, we have the ability to hit them back in a way that will completely destroy that society. And even possibly what we have is what's called a first strike counterforce capability, which means we could intentionally completely wipe out them on a first strike without having to worry about a counterstrike from the Soviet Union. So this isn't just about we had more numbers or we had more megatonnage in actual nuclear warheads. We were so far ahead of them, not only technologically, but also numerically. The USSR had a real fear of the ability to the United States to withstand any sort of threat from the USSR. So even though there is this Cold War going on, it seems like it's between equals. Nuclearly speaking, it's really not the true and real picture. And also second, as part of the background for the actual Cuban Missile Crisis, the U.S. had plotted for several years different ways of bringing down Castro. Castro was an irritant. We did not like having a communist regime right there in our backyard. This was a situation that we had not faced before within the last several decades of having a rival right there on our border. We were used to having the Western Hemisphere as our own personal playground in terms of foreign policy and the ability to make sure that things happen. So we had the Bay of Pigs in 1961, a spectacular failure of ours. Operation Mongoose, which was basically a campaign of sabotage that was supposed to bring about a Cuban uprising. Then we had the Fabrilegex exercise, which was an actual military exercise that had as its stated public goal to liberate a Caribbean island from the dictator Ortsac, which, if you'll notice, spells backward is Castro. So we were being very open and honest about our desire to have Castro out of power, to take Cuba back from the communists. It had been a client state of ours for many years. The Batista regime, which is famously corrupt, famously non-democratic, is still one that we very much supported and wanted to have on our side. And we felt that the communist regime in Cuba that took over in 1959 is one that actually was intolerable. And that's kind of the attitude that the Kennedy administration took into this. And last but not least, there's a reported memo of Defense Secretary McNamara that actually orders the execution of actual invasion plans. Now, this is more of a report. It's not something that you've been able to find in archives or anything like that. But there is this idea that this memo was out there. And so even the rumor of this kind of thing is given some credence. And last but not least, the United States had sent intermediate ballistic range missiles into Britain, Italy, and Turkey. And so from a parity standpoint of what the United States had done, is the movement of missiles into Cuba by the USSR really all that outrageous? Because we had felt, okay, Cuba's our backyard. Isn't Turkey kind of the same way for the USSR? So again, we have, when you're looking at foreign policy and looking at the interaction of these states, we have to notice how are they seeing things, not only how are we seeing things, because we have to try to understand what both sides are doing. So as a little bit of, again, the history and all of this, from May to October 1962, the USSR sends missiles to Cuba. The question is, why do they do this? There are several schools of thought about this among policymakers at the time and among people since then. First of all is to acquire some nuclear strength to balance out, to sort of, again, no intercontinental ballistic missiles, no ability to hit us from the Russian homeland. So how are they going to do that with the missiles they have available? They have to move them close enough in order to really make America fear what the USSR has to offer. Second, to deter the U.S. from a feared invasion of Cuba. We'll get into this a little bit more, but both Castro and the Soviets definitely feared that the United States might actually invade Cuba, as we had seen several other attempts through assassination, through supporting a Bay of Pigs invasion and things like this, not really work out all that well. And the last one, to humiliate President Kennedy. Because remember, we had already gone through building the Berlin Wall. We had already gone through a couple of other episodes where the Soviets were able to demonstrate to the United States, hey, we've got your number. We are defeating you politically, we're defeating you in the eyes and the perceptions of people all around the world. And if this is really what people thought of this at the time, which is there's this climactic struggle between freedom and capitalism on one side, democracy, and on the other side, the ideals of communism, that this is a titanic world struggle, then those sorts of conflicts mattered. So if you can humiliate the Democratic President of the United States in this situation, you also prevent them from doing things in the future. Maybe we are able to act in places like Vietnam or Laos or Cambodia or places in Africa and so forth, and that way make movements against the Americans and capture more territory and put it under the communist iron thumb. And then in turn, we're able to accomplish things a little bit farther along. In 1963, ExComm members believed that this was the primary motivation. The ExComm is short for Executive Committee. This was the ad hoc committee put together by President Kennedy to study and make a decision about the Cuban Missile Crisis, made up of many of his primary advisors, not only the Secretary of Defense and Secretary of State and others who were experts on the situation, but also Robert Kennedy as his most favored and trusted advisor. Others who were more maybe politically involved as opposed to having some sort of expertise, but what they did have is a part to play in all of this. But they perceived this was all about humiliating President Kennedy. It's all about tit for tat. It's an exchange between we're going to humiliate the Americans, humiliate President Kennedy, and keep him from being aggressive in the next time that we may try to do even more. But since then, this has really been seen as a misperception. People who were part of the Soviet government at the time, who were part of the decision-making process, and historians who have looked through archives and so forth, have come to the conclusion that motives 1 and 2, parity between the United States and the Soviet Union, and also trying to keep the U.S. from invading Cuba, were much more likely motives for why the Russians and the Soviets put these missiles into Cuba. And so the U.S. response had a lot to do with what President Kennedy had been doing vis-a-vis the Soviets up to this point. And on September 4th and September 13th of that very same year, he had warned Khrushchev not to put missiles in Cuba. But of course, he finds out on October 16th, the missiles are already there. Now, as you no doubt know, if you've seen any pictures of this, it's all about pictures of once the U-2s go over the island and so forth, the missiles seem to be in crates. It doesn't look like the missiles have actually been put together yet. But we find out in the mid-90s, after the fall of the Soviet Union, and some more of this information comes out, some of the participants start really talking in public, and we start having a free exchange of ideas, there were already operational nuclear weapons in Cuba, but the United States didn't know it. And so that's a major factor in, well, should we really rethink some of the lessons we might learn from the Cuban Missile Crisis if we're able to make really dire threats in the face of what would have been maybe even fatal ignorance. Now, President Kennedy says there's no way to really go about this except to say the missiles have to be taken out. Now, his motive behind why can't you accept these missiles in Cuba? I mean, yes, they're 90 miles away. Yes, they are a national security threat. But at the same time, isn't the Soviet Union really under the same kind of threat? Because our foreign policy is containment. Let's keep the Soviets within their own borders. Don't let them get beyond what they took over after World War II and have maybe been able to do after that. You know, Eastern Europe, a couple of other outposts in Southern Asia, Eastern Asia, and so forth. And he says, no, these all have to go. And the reason that he gives is credibility. The credibility of the United States to their allies. If we give in on this, our allies will not trust us and NATO's going to fall apart. NATO was America's primary response to the Soviet threat. If we don't have the Europeans, if we don't have that ability to put a line in the sand, as it were, through Germany, through north of Austria, and really saying, you're not going to be able to come any farther, if any of our allies tend to have any sort of quivering backbones, if they don't believe we're going to back them up, then we really do end up losing in the long run. There is maybe some idea that, well, did domestic politics sort of move this forward as well? Because if you're looking at October 1962, then within a few weeks, what you're also looking at is midterm elections for the Congress, which means, are the Democrats going to be taking any hit within the elections on the basis of this? And tapes since then that have been released of conversations of what was going on in the room with the executive committee at the time show hardly any concern at all with domestic politics. There were no real accusations from Republicans at the time, no real criticism, and there was no real concern about, well, what is this going to do to my election chances in 1964, his re-election chances. So I think we can dismiss that as a reason for why President Kennedy was thinking about being so firm in his opposition to these missiles. And so the options that the executive committee went on as soon as this crisis starts to develop. First is you have options of quiet diplomacy. Let's talk to them. In public, we'll be very firm, but we won't threaten anything. But then, of course, in private, what we're going to do is say, if you don't do this, we're going to do A, B, and C. But make actually no military moves. So it's all about talking. It's not about actually making gestures or making any sort of actual threat physically towards the Soviet Union. Give them a chance to just back away. Demonstrate your resolve, but not really actually have to make any moves or not. Second is the idea of a blockade, what eventually became called a quarantine. Blockade is something that's against international law. So you have to find another term for it, even if it is actually the same thing. And so this was, what we're going to do is make sure that no more missiles come in, no more military capability comes in, no more troops come in. So it's confrontational while yet still passive. And finally, actually airstrikes and an invasion. From the very beginning, most advisors said, let's invade and make an airstrike. They're not quite ready, so we can do this. And remember, things are already kind of at a fever pitch anyway, through Operation Mongoose, through the Bay of Pigs, through the heated desire that had been going on since the beginning of the Kennedy presidency and going back into the Eisenhower presidency. We really need to get Cuba into democratic hands, get it out of communist hands, get rid of Castro, get rid of all those who support it. And so, as you can see, quarantine isn't even discussed until day 3. It's not like they went into it and said, okay, we're all sitting here, what are our options? It's like their main concerns were, how effective is an invasion going to be? How effective is an airstrike going to be? Because what we're going up against is, well, how many troops do they actually have? How many anti-aircraft sites do they have in place? What do we have to deal with if we go through with the military option? We really hadn't done anything in terms of actually considering a non-military option versus a diplomatic option. Well, there's a lot of going back and forth, a lot of high drama and tension that happens. I didn't want to go through a step-by-step or blow-by-blow type of take on things, because most of us are familiar with just how close everything came. Either you read Robert Kennedy's memoirs, or you saw maybe 13 Days, or you've seen something similar to that. But in the end, what we end up with is that on October 26th, 50 years ago today, Premier Khrushchev sends President Kennedy a letter that says, we will remove the missiles if you will say we're not going to invade Cuba. And so we take that into consideration. Kennedy does, his brother, all the others. The very next day, things get upset again because we get a second letter. We also want you to take the Jupiter missiles out of Turkey, which are, again, equivalent to the missiles that are now in Cuba, but we had already been putting in Turkey for the last couple of years. And so we want a quid pro quo. And this is the major mistake that Khrushchev makes. And it's a brilliant move by the Kennedys, which is ignore the second letter. It's a private letter. It hasn't been released in public. So you don't have to pay attention to it in terms of maintaining what is your main goal in the first place. Get the missiles out, but also maintain your credibility with your allies. If you can only say, you accept in public, well, we're going to make this exchange. Get rid of the missiles, and we pledge not to invade Cuba. The thing was, the major misperception here, we didn't want to invade Cuba. That option by this time had already been taken off the table. And long term, we hadn't really been contemplating an invasion of Cuba in the first place. That had been discarded several months or even a year and a half earlier by the United States as a real option. What we were going to do is try indirect things, trying to provoke an uprising within Cuba itself, and so forth. So ultimately, what we ended up doing, what Kennedy ended up doing, was make the pledge not to invade, but also say, in private, start the process in 24 hours, or we really will, come after you. And third, he also said, through his brother, who was talking to the foreign minister of the Soviet Union, we'll take the Jupiter missiles out. The thing was, we were going to take the Jupiter missiles out of Turkey anyway. That's, again, some of the things that really point to just how different that everybody was looking at this particular situation. Just how easy it is to misunderstand the motives and the actions of other people when it actually seems so obvious. And so, a couple of the hinges of this crisis. U.S. officials feared war at 3 different points. At the very beginning, then after things had had a chance to settle down, when Soviet ships actually approached the blockade line, the point of no return, where is that going to be? And then third, on October 27th, when we got the second letter that said, take the Jupiter missiles out, but also on that very same day, a U-2 plane was shot down over Cuba. Because it seemed like, okay, a U-2 gets shot down, and at the same time, he's offering us a compromise. And as we'll find out a little bit later, those two things were very unrelated to each other. But from our perspective, they seemed very connected. And during the whole thing, we get 2 debates between the hawks and the doves. And this is really kind of the source of this whole idea of hawks versus doves when it comes to being aggressive, being warlike, and being peace-seeking. There's the debate of, should we do bombing, should we quarantine, which of course sort of shapes that entire debate. And last but not least, do we throw in the Jupiter missiles as a possible trade? The debate there is not actually to, do we trade them, but do we make it in such a way where it becomes a public trade? Do you want to get into the position of doing a quid pro quo on this issue? Because then that kind of sets a precedent for future interactions. If they say, well, we'll take our missiles out of here if you take your missiles out of there, then what happens when you start connecting this to places like Berlin? You get out of West Berlin, and maybe we'll get out of Cuba. We don't want, again, that goes straight to the heart of the credibility of NATO. And so this is where Kennedy, I think, really shows most of his leadership. He perceives, as president, that this is a situation where he can't back down, but he also doesn't want to go the military option. Those under him are speaking more from where they're sitting. They're sitting from the standpoint of, I'm Secretary of Defense, or I'm Secretary of State, or something like this. They don't see this from the standpoint of the credibility of the United States vis-a-vis their allies, and also from what could happen in the future. And so this says a lot for the idea that there's a perspective that someone in that position has that maybe the rest of us really can't see at the time that it's actually happening. And so, like I say, this is a very dangerous situation. It's obvious we came very close to actual nuclear conflict. And so what really made this so dangerous, though, is the misperceptions, the faulty ways of seeing what the motives were behind a lot of the actions that the other side took. And this comes from both the Soviet side and the American side. First, President Kennedy didn't expect any sort of missile deployment. He thought just telling Khrushchev would be enough, even though Khrushchev is a fairly aggressive person. He had been very confrontational during his term in office so far. Second, we didn't understand the fear of invasion by the Cubans and by the Russians. By not seeing that, we didn't understand that that's something we could actually defuse this entire situation with. If we had, we wouldn't have to go through the idea of thinking, well, do we need to invade? Do we need to do airstrikes and so forth? Next, Khrushchev didn't expect us to detect the missiles. How he didn't expect us to detect these missiles, I don't know. They were very well hidden, but by and large, the reason why they were detected is because of the way the anti-aircraft was set up. The anti-aircraft sites went according to the book that the Soviets had on how to defend nuclear launch sites. If they had just stuck some anti-aircraft sites in there that were different than that, that would have been fine. But they went according to the bureaucratic routine, their standard operating procedure, on how to exactly set up these sites. And so intelligence analysts from the United States, when they saw these pictures, recognized the pattern. And so immediately they're able to say, well, this means there's likelihood that nuclear missiles are going to be put there, and this is what brings it to the attention of the American government. Throughout all of this, we underestimated Soviet and Cuban military capabilities. Missiles were already active, and also we underestimated the number of troops. If we had gone in there with an invasion or an airstrike, the likelihood that we would have killed several hundred Soviet troops would have been very high. And so that's a lot of provocation for conflict directly between the Soviet Union and the United States. One of the things that's constant during the entire Cold War is that most of the conflicts between the Soviet Union and the US are indirect. We fight against their proxy. They fight against ours. We supported, the Batista regime. They supported Castro. We supported the South Vietnamese government. They supported the North Vietnamese government and the Viet Cong. Things like this. Next is JFK didn't understand how Cuba and Turkey could be very similar to one another, could be a parallel to one another, that missiles in both places could be equally threatening. He actually said, well, if we ever put missiles in in Turkey, well, that'd be just, as he called it, GD, serious or stupid. And his secretaries of state and defense basically told him, well, that's exactly what we did. And so Kennedy has to be given some misperception about that, but we'll give him some more credit later on. Second, that U-2 shoot down on October 27th was not authorized by Khrushchev. That was done by a local commandant. In a couple of unrelated things, the U.S. conducted an ICBM test in the middle of the crisis, which again can be seen as a way of saying, well, now they're launching at us. A pre-planned retaliatory airstrike that was supposed to take place was almost nearly conducted because nobody thought to actually say, well, we need to not do this in the middle of this crisis. And another president might not have been so dovish. Kennedy's experiences through getting sort of burned on the Bay of Pigs invasion because he trusted his advisors and even trying to demonstrate his own hawkishness and his own credibility led him to take a couple of actions early in his presidency that, since he was unsuccessful in those, it made him a little bit more gun-shy later on. And so somebody without that kind of experience, or someone who was a little bit more unwilling to learn from those experiences, might have been a little bit more confrontational during all this. So we can't actually overlook the fact that Kennedy was kind of conditioned by those earlier experiences. His own executive committee that he made up would have been very different if there hadn't been those sorts of experiences in the past. And so the lessons learned. First off, it's good to have options. In Cuba, the Soviet Union had no conventional capabilities. They only had nuclear or in nothing. That was their only choice. Second, nuclear confrontations are inherently chancy. There's just so many different things that can go wrong, lack of information, things of this nature, and yet in nuclear confrontations, it's either all or nothing. You either don't do it, or it takes the possibility of everybody being blown to bits as a result of it. Third, experience counts, just like I was saying about President Kennedy. Kennedy, his experiences in Cuba and Berlin and Vienna and talking directly with Khrushchev or dealing with the Soviets gave him some better judgment and wisdom in dealing with these confrontations. Second, it's really important to know who can launch nuclear weapons. Here in the United States, we take for granted the president's going to do that. Well, as we've seen demonstrated on multiple occasions, in some cases, well, do we give the commander on site the ability to make that decision? If they're out of touch with direct communication with the president or the premier of Russia or whoever, do we give them that kind of authority? We're running into that problem very seriously right now with Iran. Iran, it's very difficult to actually tell who's in control. You've got Ahmadinejad on one side, you have the Supreme Council of Iran on the other, and so we have religious leaders, we have those who are not religious, we have secular leaders, and it's like, who's actually in charge of the nuclear program within Iran itself? It's a very difficult question that is not immediately available. And last but not least, because we backed away from this, because we avoided nuclear confrontation, it's often assumed that in nuclear confrontations, countries will back away because of the assured destruction of each other. We should not assume that a country will not take a fatal action, that they will not do something that will actually end in their destruction. One little example of this is Admiral Yamamoto during World War II. He told the high command of Japan, okay, I can do this, I can win, I can run amok for a year. This starts to extend out to 2 and 3 years. I can't give you any guarantees, we will most likely lose. They went ahead and did it anyway. Because, again, they miscalculated on what could possibly happen. We cannot make the assumption that survival will be every country's primary concern. They may have something else that they would rather demonstrate and decide on rather than that.